The blizzard nearly swallowed her voice, but the word reached him. "Shelter! I'll work for every breath you give me." Snow clung to Mavra's green skin like shards of bone. If Gideon hadn't opened the door that second, she would have died on his stone porch. Winter in the Iron Peaks didn't arrive. It claimed. The wind came down from the ridgeline, carrying the smell of frozen earth and old rust, biting through every gap in the wood like it had a personal grudge. Gideon Marsh stood at his window and watched the valley disappear behind a curtain of white. The trees bent low, the river groaned under new ice, the sky and the ground became the same pale nothing. He moved through the cabin the way he always did, boots by the door, firewood stacked with military precision, a turnip stew slow cooking on the forge's side plate. Annie sat at the table with a stub of charcoal and a scrap of paper, drawing horses the way she always did when the walls felt too close. "How bad is it, Papa?" she asked without looking up. "Bad enough to stay inside," he said. The iron solstice was tomorrow. It was the night the old settlers called the longest dark, the point in winter when the cold stopped testing you and started trying to keep you. In the frontier towns like Ironhold and Goldport, they lit fires on their porches and put warm bread on window ledges for the spirits that wandered the roads. Gideon didn't do any of that. He hadn't since Margaret. He sat by the fire with a cup of black coffee and a piece of cracked leather he was stitching back together. His hands knew the work. They didn't need him to be present for it. The cabin groaned around him. It was a good cabin, solid oak beams, a stone hearth wide enough to sleep beside, shutters that didn't rattle too badly. He'd built half of it himself and repaired the other half twice over. It sat on a small rise above the Tescan River, near the chain ferry crossing that had been his father's before it became his. The ferry kept him and Annie alive. Just barely, but alive. He wasn't a rich man. He wasn't even a comfortable one. But he was a man who kept his word, paid his debts, and slept without screaming most nights. He figured that was enough. Outside, the blizzard strengthened. He felt it before he heard it. A subtle change in the cabin's pressure, as though the storm was pressing itself against the walls and listening. Then a sound cut through the howl of the wind. Not a branch snapping, not the ferry chains rattling. Something different. He set down his coffee. It came again, low and broken, like someone trying to speak through frozen teeth. Gideon stood slowly and crossed to the door. He pulled his coat from the hook and reached for the iron latch. Something in his chest told him to leave it. Something older and quieter told him not to. He opened the door. The cold hit him like a hammer, and on his stone porch, half swallowed by the dark and the snow, stood a figure that barely looked real. She was tall, taller than him by nearly a head, with skin the color of deep moss and long black hair plastered flat by the ice. Her leather vest was torn in 3 places. Her hands were the color of raw meat. Her green eyes were barely open, glazed with the dull shine of someone already halfway gone. She opened her cracked lips. "Shelter," she said. "I'll work for every breath you give me." Gideon looked at her for one full heartbeat. Then he stepped aside. As he pulled her through the door, the fire guttered hard in the draught, both flames leaning sideways at once toward her, as though reaching, not away from the door, toward it. He paused. The draught died and the flames straightened. He told himself it was the door seal, old wood, bad winter, but the direction stayed with him, lodged like a splinter at the back of his mind. Right now, there was a dying orc on his floor. He laid her near the fire. Her body was heavier than it looked, dense muscle beneath the soaked leather, the kind of weight that came from a life spent moving across rough land. Gideon knelt beside her and started pulling off the worst of the wet gear, the torn vest, the ice-caked boots, a cracked pauldron of boiled leather held by a single strap. Annie was on the stairs, 3 steps down, her charcoal still in her hand. "Papa," she whispered, "is she going to die?" "Not if I can help it," he said. He tucked 2 wool blankets over her and added another log to the fire until the room glowed amber. Her breathing was shallow, but it was there, slow, ragged pulls that steadied bit by bit as the warmth reached her. The color didn't come back to her lips right away. It took a long time. Gideon made broth from the stew pot and sat beside her, watching the fire and listening to the storm. She was an orc. That much was obvious, and he didn't need to think hard about what that meant around here. In Ironhold, the word orc on a man's lips usually came with a curl of contempt. The old settlers called them the Green Tide, remnants of the border wars, a people without land and without law. The frontier was full of that kind of talk, passed around like bad coin until nobody remembered who made it first. Gideon didn't have much use for that kind of talk. He'd fought in the border wars. He'd seen what was on both sides. She'd come from the northern reaches. He could tell from the cut of her gear, the bone and crystal beads braided into her hair, the faint clan markings in dark ink along her forearms. The reaches were bad country in summer. In winter, they were the kind of place you only left if you had no choice. Nobody survives that crossing alone, he thought, unless they're running from something worse than the cold. He stayed awake through the night beside her, feeding the fire and watching her breathe. By the time pale grey light began to show at the window cracks, her colour had come back slightly, and her breathing had deepened into something closer to real sleep. He leaned back in his chair and let his eyes close, just for a moment. Annie was already up when he woke, crouched beside the orc woman with enormous eyes, watching her breathe. "She's still here," Annie whispered. "She is," he said. She woke on the second day. Gideon heard her move from the chair where he'd been dozing. Careful footsteps on the plank floor, weight distributed slow and deliberate, the kind of quiet that came from years of living where noise got you killed. The fire had burned low. Outside, the blizzard had thinned into a steady, hard snowfall. She stopped when she realized he was there. "You stayed up," she said. It wasn't a question. "Someone had to watch the fire," he said. She stood at the window and looked out at the white. The Tescan Valley was buried. The guide chains were invisible under ice. "You built all this?" she asked, meaning the cabin. "Half," he said. "Fix the rest." She turned and looked at the room properly for the first time. The careful stacks of tools along the wall, the woodworking bench in the corner, the rows of iron hooks holding rope, harness and chain. Everything worn but clean, everything in its place. "A carpenter," she said. "A ferryman," he said. "Carpenter is what I do when the river's frozen." She nodded slowly, filing that away. He set down his coffee and looked at her directly. She was still wearing the blankets around her shoulders. Without the ice and the dying animal urgency, he could see her clearly. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe mid-20s, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned very early to take up as little space as possible. That bothered him more than he expected. "You don't have to explain yourself," he said. "Not right now." She looked at him. "Most men who let strangers through their door want something for it," she said. "I want you to finish healing," he said. "That's all." A silence stretched between them. Outside, the snow hissed softly against the glass. "I'll stay until the storm passes," she said carefully. "Then I'll move on." "All right," he said. She sat down on the floor near the fire, cross-legged, and pulled the talisman from her wrist. She turned the carved bone feather in her fingers, slowly, methodically, the way a man might work worry beads. He'd seen orc shamans do the same thing with carved totems, reading the grain of the bone the way a carpenter read wood. "Clan piece?" he asked. She paused. "My mother's." He didn't ask anything else. Annie appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown. She looked at Maevra, then at her father, then back at Maevra. "Are you hungry again?" Annie asked. Maevra blinked. "I could eat." Annie disappeared and came back in 4 minutes with half a loaf of dark bread and a wedge of hard cheese on a tin plate, which she carried down with enormous care and set on the floor next to the orc woman like a small offering. Maevra looked at the plate for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Quiet, careful. "You're welcome," Annie said, and sat down beside her. Gideon watched them in the firelight, the small human girl and the large, tired orc woman sitting together on the floor of his cabin on the longest night of the year. He felt something shift inside his chest. Small and quiet, like a hinge turning that hadn't moved in a long time. He picked up his coffee and turned back to the leather in his hands. But he didn't start sewing again right away. The storm broke on the third day. It didn't ease gracefully. It simply stopped, the way pain sometimes does, all at once and without warning. The sky went from iron grey to pale blue in a single morning, and the valley below emerged from the white, like something being slowly remembered. Maevra stood on the porch and looked at it. She'd slept properly for the first time, and she didn't know how long. Her hands had mostly stopped hurting. The worst of the cold had left her bones, though not entirely. The deep cold never left entirely, she knew. It just moved somewhere quieter inside you. She'd meant to be gone by now. That had been the plan. She heard the door open behind her, and Annie came out, wrapped in a huge wool coat 3 sizes too large, carrying a tin mug in both hands. "Papa says the river might unfreeze by spring," Annie said, "but there's still a lot of work before then." "What kind of work?" Maevra asked. Annie counted on her fingers. "The east fence is broken in 2 places. The barn roof leaks near the back beam. The crossing needs its guidelines oiled before they rust through. Papa can't do all of it alone." She paused. "He doesn't like to ask for help. He thinks it means he's failing." Maevra looked at her. "How old are you?" 9, Annie said. "You think like someone older." Annie handed her the mug. "Mama used to say that too." Maevra wrapped both hands around the warm tin and said nothing. She watched the valley. A hawk crossed the white sky in a long, slow arc and vanished behind the tree line. She was still here. She'd told herself she wouldn't be. When Gideon came out an hour later with his tools, she was already at the east fence, digging out the broken post with a spade she'd found in the barn. He stopped and watched her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I stay," she said, not looking up. "I work. That is the agreement." "We didn't make an agreement." "We did," she said. "It was implied." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the second spade, leaning against the fence. They worked side by side until the light began to go. She was stronger than him, considerably and without apology, and he noticed that she never made a point of it, never moved ahead of him, or let the difference become a thing between them. She matched his pace. That told him something. That evening, after Annie had gone to bed, she sat at the table across from him. The fire cracked softly. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment. "I was a scout," she said, "for my clan in the northern reaches." She said the next part the way people say things they've rehearsed in private until the words stopped hurting. "A man named Crane sent men to our winter camp while I was away on a pass, claimed papers from a border market, legal paperwork for people. They burned the camp and took 7 of ours in chains." She stopped. "When I came back, there was smoke and silence. I've been moving south ever since, away from his reach, toward wherever it ended." He looked at her across the table. "How long ago?" he asked. 18 months, she said. "I don't think he's stopped looking." He nodded slowly. He didn't push further. "You belong here." Annie's voice came from the top of the stairs, small and certain. Maevra looked up. She'd thought the girl was asleep. Annie met her eyes with the steady calm of someone who had already made up her mind about a thing, long before saying it out loud. Her face carried the full weight of what she'd heard. The camp, the chains, the smoke. And she hadn't looked away from any of it. Maevra turned back to the fire, her jaw set and her hands still around the cup. That night, Gideon lay awake listening to the cabin settle. He thought about rivers. How you didn't always know the depth until you were already in. She stayed. It happened without ceremony, the way things that matter usually do. The storm passed, then a week went by, then another, and Maevra was still there, waking before him, working alongside him, eating at his table and sitting near his fire with her bone feather in her hands. She never asked for silver. She never complained. What she did was work. She repaired the east fence properly, with notched joints and braced corners that would hold through worse winters than this one. She fixed the barn roof beam by beam, climbing without hesitation, moving across the high timbers with an ease that made Annie gasp from below. She oiled the guide lines, untangled the cross-line ropes, and reseated 2 of the iron posts that had shifted in the summer floods. Gideon watched her work, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the simple, steady satisfaction of things being done right. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked one evening, patching a section of the dock. "My clan built and moved and rebuilt," she said, driving a peg with one clean stroke. "Nomads don't stop needing shelter just because they don't stay in one place." He thought about that. Annie started following her everywhere. Not with questions, she was observant enough to know when to be quiet, but with presence, trotting alongside her through the yard and the barn and the riverbank like a small, faithful shadow. Maevra tolerated it at first, and then, gradually, something else. She began to explain things without being asked. The names of tools, the grain of different woods, the way to read the river's surface for ice thickness. One afternoon, Gideon came into the barn and found Maevra crouched beside Annie, showing her how to braid rope. Their heads were close together. Annie was laughing at something. He backed out quietly and didn't say anything. That night he dreamed of Margaret, but not the way he usually did. It wasn't the fever, or the burial, or the terrible particular silence of the house on the 3rd morning. He dreamed of her laughing at the kitchen table with a warmth that filled the room. He woke up with a quiet ache, rather than the usual hard grief. He lay there in the dark and thought about that. Spring was still distant, but the days were lengthening, a few degrees warmer each week. The Tescan was still locked under ice, but he could hear it moving underneath, the deep, slow moan of a river remembering itself. That evening, before supper, Maevra came in from the yard and set a small object on the table. A carved horse. It was rough, the quick work of someone who'd borrowed 20 minutes and a belt knife, but it had something alive in it, the way the head was turned slightly as if listening. "For Annie," she said simply. Annie picked it up and turned it over in her hands, eyes wide. Gideon looked at Maevra. She shrugged one shoulder and sat down, as if it were nothing, but she was watching Annie's face, and outside, though neither of them saw it, a crow landed on the south-facing gate post, the road that came from Goldport, tilted its head once toward the cabin window, and flew away without sound. It was the first crow Gideon had seen all winter. He would not see another until Roland arrived. The peace lasted through the thaw. The Tescan broke in early spring, a slow, groaning crack that started upstream and spread down the valley over 2 days, the ice splitting in long blue fissures and grinding south in heavy chunks. Gideon ran the crossing again by the 3rd week of the season. His first run met with the particular relief of rivermen who had spent winter wondering if the rope would hold. Maevra worked the crossing with him. She was better at reading the current than he was, he noticed. She stood at the front of the flat deck and watched the water with a stillness that made her look like part of the landscape, calling adjustments by hand signal, angle left, hold, ease, with a precision that cut his crossing times by 1/3. "Current memory," she called it when he asked. "River tells you what it's done before." Trade came back with the season. Farmers with seed wagons, tinkers with loaded mules, a pair of surveyors from the south who paid in paper notes and looked at Maevra with the particular careful blankness of men performing politeness they hadn't practiced. Gideon watched those two and said nothing, but he stood at the rail until their wagon was on the far bank and out of sight. 2 days after the surveyors crossed, a rider came down from the Goldport road. Gideon didn't see him at first. He was under the dock replacing a cracked plank, but Maevra went still on the bank above him in a way that made him look up before he heard anything. One rider, a second horse riderless, loaded with packs. The rider pulled up at the gate and studied the property with the slow, methodical attention of a man counting exits. He wore a long duster, faded brown, 2 pistols on a crossbelt, a short sword at his hip. His face was lean and sun-cracked, and when he smiled, which he did slowly, seeing Gideon climb up from under the dock, the smile had nothing warm in it. Bounty man. "Nice crossing you've got," the rider said. "Name's Roland, rode up from Goldport following a lead. Spoke to a surveyor team 2 days south of here. They described an orc woman working a river crossing in this valley. Northern Reaches markings, they said. Tall." He looked past Gideon at the property. Seen anything like that come through? So that was how. The surveyors. 2 days and a long road south to Goldport, and a man whose job was following threads had picked it up. Gideon kept his face flat. "Just me and my daughter here. Ferry business." Roland looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then his eyes moved, deliberate, unhurried, to Maevra, who was standing at the far end of the dock coiling rope with her back turned and her head down. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, then back at Gideon. "Sure," he said pleasantly. "Well, I'll be around." He pulled his horse around and rode back up the Goldport road without hurrying. Gideon stood at the gate and watched him go. He waited until the hoofbeats were fully gone. Then he turned. Maevra was already looking at him, the rope loose in her hands. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. She was at the table when he came back inside. Her hands were flat on the wood, and her jaw was set, and she was staring at the grain of the table like she was reading something in it. She didn't look up when he came in. Annie sat beside her, close enough to touch, saying nothing, just present. "You know him," Gideon said. "I know what he is," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "He found you through the surveyors," he said. "That trail ends here. He knows you're on this property." She nodded once. "Roland works for Crane. The claim papers Crane holds were ruled void 3 years ago by courts in the south. Roland doesn't care. Crane doesn't care. The law out here is whatever a man with 2 pistols decides it is on a given morning." Gideon's jaw tightened. "How long has he been following you?" "Long enough to be patient," she said. "He waits until a person feels safe, then he moves fast." He looked at her. "I'm not going to turn you over to anyone," he said. "You don't know what it costs to keep me here," she said. "I know what it costs to send you back out there," he said. She didn't answer. Annie reached over and put her small hand over Maevra's without saying a word. Maevra looked down at it. Her jaw worked once, and then she was still. Gideon stood and went to the corner where his tools were racked. He lifted down the long-handled felling hammer and set it on the bench. Then he turned. "Roland said he'd be around. That means he's watching and waiting. He wants to take you without a fight if he can. We don't let him pick the time and place." He paused. "I know every crossing point in this valley. Every blind approach, every piece of high ground, every place a man on horseback has to slow down. We use that." Maevra studied him. She stood slowly, crossed the room, and picked up the felling hammer. She turned it in her hands, testing the weight and balance with the unhurried attention of someone who knew tools. She set it back down. "He'll come from the south bank," she said. "Upstream crossing at night, where the river shallows. Cuts around the ferry entirely so there's no alarm." She said it with the certainty of someone who had survived enough pursuit to know how hunters thought. "He won't come alone." "Then we won't be where he expects us to be," Gideon said. They planned through the evening, positions, signals, the specific geography of each approach. Maevra knew how trackers moved. Gideon knew the land. Between the two of them, the valley's shape became something they could use. When they were done, the fire had burned to coals. Annie had fallen asleep in her chair at the table, her head resting on her arms, the carved horse still in one hand. Gideon carried her upstairs without waking her. The next 2 days were the strange kind of quiet that comes before weather. The valley looked the same. The crossing ran. Trade moved through, but the light felt different, flat and watchful, the way it got before a storm that hadn't shown itself yet. Gideon found himself checking the Goldport Road each morning. Maevra said nothing about it, but he noticed she never had her back to open ground. On the second evening, after Annie was in bed, she came and sat near the hearth. He sat across from her with his coffee gone cold in his hands, watching the embers. "Tell me about the Reaches," he said. "Not an interrogation. Just the kind of question you ask when the planning is done and the dark outside is total." She was quiet for a moment. "Cold in winter," she said. "Beautiful in summer if you know where to look. The tundra goes flat in every direction and then breaks open at the river canyons, big, deep green. My clan followed the thaw north each year and came back south before the first hard frost." She paused. "We were good at it. We'd been doing it longer than anyone could count." "What was it like?" he asked. "Living like that. Like being part of something larger than yourself," she said. "Every person had a place, not assigned, earned. My mother was a healer. My uncle tracked game. I was a scout because I moved quietly and I didn't need to sleep as much as others." She turned the talisman. "When you know what you're for, you're not afraid of the dark. You're just in it, doing what you're supposed to do." He thought about that. "What do you do when the thing you were built for is gone?" he asked. She looked at him across the fire. The question wasn't just about her. They both knew it. "You keep moving," she said, "until you find something worth stopping for." A long silence settled between them. The wood in the hearth cracked and settled. Outside, an owl called once and went quiet. "Margaret was sick for 2 years before she died," he said. It was the first time he'd said her name to anyone outside of Annie in a long time. "She made me promise not to stop. Keep the crossing running. Keep Annie going. Don't make a monument out of the loss." He looked at the embers. "I've been doing the letter of it." Maevra watched him. "Between my people," she said. "When the winter is too long and the grief is too heavy, the elders say, the cold is not death, it is waiting." She paused. "It means the heart is still there. It just needs the right season." He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the fire, and her face was open in a way it wasn't usually, unguarded, tired, honest. He reached across and put his hand briefly over hers. Just for a moment, just enough. She didn't pull away. He moved his hand back and picked up his cold coffee. "Try to sleep," he said. "A few hours at least." "I'll take the second watch," she said. "I don't sleep as much as others." He almost smiled at that. "I remember," he said. He went to his room and lay down with his boots on. The dark behind his eyes was quiet rather than loud. He slept, not long, but deep. The clean sleep of someone who has made a decision and is no longer waiting to make it. He woke before dawn to the sound of Maevra moving quietly downstairs, taking her position. The third day was coming. Roland came at first light. He brought 2 men. They came from the south bank, upstream crossing at night, where the river shallowed, cutting around the ferry exactly as Maevra had said they would. Gideon was already at the dock when they came down the tree line. Maevra was in the east tree line, in position since before dawn, invisible in the grey light. The Tescan ran fast this time of year, swollen with snowmelt, green-brown and cold. The ferry sat heavy on its lines in the current, loaded with a stack of lumber from the previous run. Gideon stood on the dock with his hands visible, the felling hammer leaning against the winch post 10 feet to his right. Roland walked ahead of his men. His duster was open. His hand rested on his pistol with the ease of someone who did this often. "I told you I'd be around," Roland said. "You did," Gideon said. "Step aside, ferryman. My business isn't with you." "I know what your business is," Gideon said, "and you're not going to find it here." Roland's smile thinned. "She's not your blood, not your wife, not even your kind." He said the last 2 words with careful precision, like a blade laid flat to show you the edge. Why would a man throw his life away for a green stray? Because she's not a stray, Gideon said, and this is her home. Roland drew. Gideon dropped behind the winch post as the shot cracked off the iron. He got a hand on the felling hammer as he moved, came up swinging low, not at Roland, but at the winch crank to his left. The winch released. The loaded ferry lurched hard in the current, slamming its broadside into the dock pilings with a deep, resonant boom that shook the whole structure. Roland stumbled. One of his men went down on one knee. Maevra came out of the east tree line. She moved low and fast and without sound, exactly as planned, hitting the second man from his blind side before he'd finished turning. She had the axe haft, not the blade. Back of it across his knee, then across the back of his neck when he buckled. Clean, controlled. He went down and stayed down. The third man turned toward her, and that was the moment Gideon had been waiting for. He closed the distance on Roland while the man's attention split, caught the gun arm with one hand, and drove the hammer handle hard across his jaw. Roland's pistol spun into the river. The third man looked at his downed partner, at Roland, at the orc woman and the ferryman standing in the early morning light. He made the only calculation left to him and ran, back up the south slope, toward the upstream crossing, toward Goldport. Roland was on his back on the dock, breathing through his teeth, blood at his lip, his remaining pistol still holstered. He'd never gotten his second hand to it. He lay there for a long moment, not calculating, just beaten and knowing it, the particular stillness of a man whose body has stopped before his pride has. Gideon crouched down so Roland could see his face clearly. "He'll tell Crane," Roland said, meaning the man who'd run. "Let him," Gideon said. "Crane's papers were voided in 2 jurisdictions. What happened here this morning was 2 people defending their home against armed trespassers. Your man watched you draw first on a civilian on his own property." He paused, letting that land. "That's not a story Crane wants near a frontier marshal. You ride back, you keep your life and your freedom. You come back here, you come back to charges. And now you've got a witness who'll say exactly how it started." Roland stared at the grey sky. His jaw was swelling. His hand, when he flexed it, trembled slightly. He wasn't doing legal arithmetic. He was a man who had ridden a long way, been hit harder than expected, and was looking up at 2 people who were not afraid of him anymore. That was the thing that settled it, not the law, not the logic, but the simple fact that the fear he'd counted on wasn't there. "Cold trail," he said. His voice was flat and final, the voice of a man closing a ledger. They let him up. He moved stiffly, collected his horse from the tree line, and left without looking back. They watched until the sound of hooves faded past the ridge and the valley went quiet again. Just the river, the birds starting up in the trees, the morning light coming full and pale over the high peaks. Maevra stood beside him on the dock. The bone-feather talisman caught the early light at her wrist. She was looking at the water. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he said. She looked at him sideways, then up at the cabin where Annie had appeared in the doorway in her oversized coat, arms crossed. "Did you win?" Annie called. "We won," Gideon said. Annie pumped one fist and disappeared back inside. Maevra made a sound in her throat, low and sudden and unguarded. A real laugh, the kind that surprised the person it came from. He stood there and let the morning settle over him. The Tescan moved south in its broad channel, carrying snowmelt from the high peaks down through the valley and out toward country he'd never seen. The ferry sat steady on its lines. The lumber was undamaged. The day's work was waiting. He thought about the fire on the night she arrived, both flames bending toward the door, toward her, against the wind. He'd told himself it was the door seal. But standing here now in the full light, with the valley open and the sound of Annie moving in the kitchen above, he understood it the way you understand things that don't need explaining. The fire had known before he did. Some things arrived the way winter arrived, not gently, Not with announcement, but with the absolute certainty of something that had always been coming. He picked up the felling hammer. "River might run cargo this afternoon," he said. "I'll ready the lines." And she said. They walked back up toward the cabin together, and the valley was still and bright around them, and somewhere behind the far ridge, winter was finally, genuinely retreating. Not gone, not forgotten, but moving on, the way all seasons did, making room for whatever came next.